So in the last lecture, you learned that this user object that we are returning here will not be available as the return value of this getUser function here, right? In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to use a callback to get this user object. So first, let's delete this return one here because we don't really need this. Now, we need to make a small change to the signature of this getUser function. We need to add another parameter. We call this callback. A callback is a function that we're going to call when the result of an asynchronous operation is ready. In this case, at this point, the result is ready. So we're going to call this function, we're going to call this back with this result, with this user object. So we simply call this callback and give it this user object, like this. Now, back to line 2, we're not going to get a return value from this function, so let's delete this. So now our getUser function needs a second argument. We need to pass a function that will be called with this argument, with this user object. So we can pass a function here. This function takes a user, right? Because we're passing a user object here. So this function takes a user. And now we have access to this user object that we have read from the database. So we can display it on the console. User, user, like this. Also, we don't need this line anymore. Now, let's run this program and see what happens. So node index.js. So we have before, after, reading a user from a database, and this is our user object. Beautiful. So this is an example of a callback or a callback function. When the result of an asynchronous operation is ready, this function will be called with the result, in this case, the user object. Now here we can also use the arrow function syntax. So user goes to a code block. It's the same thing. Now here's a small exercise for you. In this program, let's imagine once we read a user object from the database, then we're going to look at this property, GitHub username, and then we're going to call GitHub API to get the list of repositories for this user. So I'm going to create a function here, get repositories. This function takes an argument, which is the username of a user on GitHub, and it's going to return an array with the list of repositories. So repo 1, repo 2, and repo 3. Now, this is a synchronous function here. We don't have any asynchronous code. We don't have a call to set timeout or anything that is asynchronous. Your job is to convert this function to an asynchronous function and then call it here. So once we have the user object, we need to get the repositories. So as an exercise, convert this function to an asynchronous function that takes 2 seconds to complete and use a callback to get the result here, the list of repositories, and finally display those repositories on the console. So pause the video now, do this exercise, and when you're done, come back and continue watching. All right, now to make this function asynchronous, again, I'm going to use set timeout, give it the callback function here, and a timeout of 2 seconds, right? Now in this function, we can do a simple console.log calling GitHub API. This is completely optional. We don't really need this as part of this exercise. Now finally, we need to return this array to the client or consumer of this function. However, as you learned earlier, here we cannot return a value like this. Instead, we need to use a callback. So we add a second parameter here, callback, which is a function. We're going to call this function with this array. So we're going to replace return with a call to our callback function. As simple as that. So now we have an asynchronous function that takes a callback to return the result. Now, back to our main code. Here we have the user object. So after that, we're going to get the repositories for this user. So we call get repositories. As an argument, we pass user.github username. As a second argument, we need to pass a callback function. This callback function takes an argument, which is an array of strings. So let's call this repos, goes to a code block. Now here we can display these repos on the console. So repos. Now let's remove this. We don't need this anymore. Also, I'm going to remove this line to display the user, because earlier we tested this program and it worked successfully. So this is the end result. Now, back in the terminal, let's run node index. So we have before and after. 2 seconds later, we're reading a user from database, and 2 seconds later, we got the result from GitHub API. So we got an array of 3 strings.